In the last decade, at least 3 mail-order brides have been murdered by the American husbands they barely knew. But a century earlier, the gamble was even more desperate. In the spring of 1891, a widowed mother of 4 answered a stranger's newspaper ad for a wife. She traveled west for a new beginning. What she found was an isolated ranch, a town that whispered, and a dangerous secret about the first wife who vanished. This is the true story of mail-order marriage in the American West, a system built on desperation and hope, where advertisements in papers like the Matrimonial News promised security but often delivered peril. For every success, there were countless stories of deception and danger. So what happened when Eliza Carter, with her 4 young children, stepped off the train to meet the rancher who had paid her way? Eliza Carter stepped down onto the dusty platform of Cedar Junction, Wyoming, her 4 children clinging to her worn skirts. The journey from St. Louis had taken 5 days, a blur of soot and strangers, paid for with the last of her savings and the promise in a stranger's letters. The man waiting was Silas Grant. 38 years old, with dark hair slicked back and a sharp jawline, he stood as still as a fence post. He wore a black shirt buttoned to the neck under a dark vest, and when he tipped his hat, his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He described himself in his letters as a rancher of modest means, seeking a helpmate to share the burdens of a remote property. What he hadn't mentioned was that his first wife, Elena, had vanished from that same ranch 2 years prior. Eliza had been driven to his advertisement by a desperation so profound it felt like a physical weight. Her husband, Thomas, a carpenter, had died suddenly of a fever the previous winter, leaving behind debts that swallowed their small home. With 4 children under the age of 10 and no family to speak of, her choices had narrowed to the poorhouse or a leap of blind faith. She'd found Silas's notice in the back pages of the Matrimonial News, a publication that, by the 1890s, had facilitated thousands of such unions. His words were direct, not flowery. He wrote of clean air, honest work, and a need for steady female companionship. He enclosed train fare. For a woman with nothing, it was a lifeline. The ride to the Grant Ranch took 3 hours by wagon, the prairie opening up into a vast, silent expanse that seemed to swallow sound. The children, wide-eyed and exhausted, fell asleep against each other. Silas spoke little, pointing out a distant hawk, commenting on the lack of rain. His hands on the reins were clean, the nails trimmed, but a long, pale scar traced across his knuckles. When Eliza asked about the land, he gave short, factual answers. When she asked if there were neighbors, he simply said, "Not close." The isolation was immediate and absolute. They arrived as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting the property in long, chilling shadows. The house was a solid 2-story structure of dark timber, but it had a hunched, watchful quality. The porch was empty, no curtains hung in the windows. Behind it stood a large barn and a corral holding a few head of cattle. It was a working ranch, but it lacked the lived-in clutter of a home. As Silas helped the children down, the front door opened and an older man, grizzled and lean, stepped out. "This is Walter," Silas said. "And he'll show you the inside." Walter nodded once, his eyes sliding over Eliza and the children with a look that was neither welcome nor hostility, but simple assessment. Inside, the house was spotlessly clean and oppressively quiet. The furniture was sturdy, the floors scrubbed raw. There were no personal touches, no books, no knickknacks, no evidence of a woman's hand ever having been there, aside from a large framed photograph on the mantel. It showed a younger Silas standing beside a woman with soft features and light hair. Elena. Eliza felt a cold prickle on her neck. "Your room is upstairs," Silas said, his voice echoing in the stillness. "The children can share the loft. Supper is at 6. He turned and walked back outside, leaving them with Walter, who wordlessly pointed them toward the stairs. That first week was a study in eerie routine. Silas was never cruel. He provided food, such as it was simple, hearty fare. He built a new stool for the youngest to reach the wash basin, but his kindness was procedural, detached. He spent long hours away on the range, and Walter, who lived in a bunkhouse near the barn, was a silent, looming presence. The children, confused and homesick, cried at night. Eliza would soothe them, her own fear a knot in her stomach, listening to the wind howl across the empty plains. She began to explore the house during the day, a deep unease settling in. Drawers were empty. Closets held only Silas's clothes and a few spare blankets. It was as if Elena Grant had been meticulously erased. The first real crack in the facade came when they needed supplies. Sealers hitched the wagon for the 2-hour trip to the nearest town, a place called Bitter Creek. He was even quieter than usual on the journey, his posture rigid. In town, the reaction to their arrival was unmistakable. Conversations on the boardwalk stalled. Men tipped their hats, but their eyes were guarded. Women gathered in doorways, their whispers just audible. At the general store, the proprietor, a Mr. Higgins, was polite but stiff. As Sealers checked his list, Higgins leaned slightly toward Eliza, his voice low. "You're the new Mrs. Grant, then?" It wasn't a question. He glanced toward the door where Sealers stood. "Fine spread of land he has out there. Isolated, though." He paused, weighing his words. "My wife, she packed a basket. Some jams, a pie for you and the youngsters. She said to tell you welcome." The gesture was kind, but his eyes held a warning. He wouldn't say more. On the ride home, Eliza gathered her courage. The people in town, they seemed, she trailed off. Sealers' jaw tightened. "Small minds," he said flatly, not looking at her. "They thrive on gossip." Elena didn't care for them either. It was the first time he had voluntarily spoken his first wife's name. "What happened to her, Sealers?" Eliza asked, the question hanging in the dry air. He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "She left," he finally said, the words clipped. "One morning she was just gone, took nothing with her. Some folks think she ran off, some think worse." He turned his head, and for a split second the controlled mask slipped, revealing a flash of something raw and angry. "But this land holds its secrets close. It's best not to go digging." Night unable to sleep, Eliza went downstairs for a glass of water. Passing the parlor, she saw a sliver of light under the door to Sealers' study, a room he always kept locked. She heard the low murmur of voices, Sealers and Walter. She crept closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Can't have her asking questions in town." Walter's rasp was barely audible. "It was settled." Sealers' reply was a cold, hard whisper. "It's not settled while she's in my house. She stays, Walter. She's useful, but she needs to understand the way things are." There was a thud, like a book being slammed. "And if she does?" Walter asked. The pause that followed was filled with a silence more terrifying than any words. Standing frozen in the dark hall, Eliza Carter understood one thing with perfect, chilling clarity. She had not been brought here for companionship. She had been brought here to replace a ghost. And the man who had paid her way was afraid that ghost might still be watching. The next morning, Eliza moved through the routine like a sleepwalker, her mind replaying that whispered threat in the dark. Over breakfast, Sealers was his usual, quiet self, passing the salt, asking the oldest boy if he'd finished his chores. The normalcy was more frightening than any outburst. It meant the man who'd said, "She needs to understand the way things are," was utterly controlled, and his control extended over every silent acre of this land. Her only advantage was that he saw her as useful, and as a woman with 4 children, she posed no physical threat. She decided to weaponize that assumption. She would be the perfect, obedient wife, while quietly searching for the truth of Elena Grant. She started in the least suspicious place, the root cellar. While fetching potatoes, she let her eyes adjust to the gloom. It was packed with preserves, sacks of grain, and tools. In a far corner, partly hidden by a burlap sack, was a small traveling trunk. Her heart leapt. It was unlocked. Inside, she found not clothes, but a carefully folded woolen dress, a hairbrush tangled with long, pale strands, and a small, leather-bound Bible. On the flyleaf, in a delicate hand, was inscribed, "To Elena on our wedding day, may God bless this union, Sealers." This was no trunk packed for a journey. This was a shrine, or evidence hidden away from prying eyes. At the very bottom, her fingers touched paper, a single folded letter dated just a month before Elena vanished. It was from a sister back in Pennsylvania. The last line made Eliza's blood run cold. "I pray this confinement passes easily, dear sister, and that you and Sealers are blessed with a healthy child come spring." Elena had been pregnant. Eliza replaced everything exactly as she found it, the taste of metal in her mouth. A pregnant wife doesn't simply leave, taking nothing. The townsfolk's fear, the locked study, Walter's presence, it all coalesced into a single, terrifying possibility. That afternoon, under the guise of airing out bedding, she investigated the barn loft. In the hay near the back wall, she found something the men had missed, a single small woman's boot, caked in dried mud. It was too small to be Walter's, too delicate for ranch work. It looked like it had been ripped off in a struggle. The discovery changed her mission from investigation to survival. She began stockpiling, a little flour secreted in an old handkerchief. a kitchen knife wrapped in cloth and tucked under a loose floorboard in the children's loft. She observed the ranch's rhythms with the intensity of a strategist. Silas and Walter rode out to the north pasture every Tuesday and Thursday, leaving for 4 to 5 hours. The next Tuesday, as soon as their figures disappeared over the ridge, she acted. She herded the children outside to play near the corral, a location with a clear view of the approach. Then, heart-hammering, she approached the locked study door. The lock was solid, but the window beside it was loose in its frame, warped by the dry air. Using the kitchen knife, she pried at the sill until it gave way with a soft groan. Room was a tomb of masculine order. A heavy desk, account ledgers, a rack of rifles on the wall. She went straight to the desk. The first drawer held legal documents, the deed to the ranch, which was in Silas's name alone, purchased 2 months after Alina's disappearance. The second drawer was empty but for a small, felt-lined box. Inside was a woman's gold wedding band. Eliza picked it up. Engraved on the inner band were the initials EM and SG and a date, Alina's ring. Why would a woman who supposedly ran off leave her wedding ring behind? The third drawer was stuck. She pulled harder, and it jerked open, revealing not papers, but a gun. A small, pearl-handled derringer. And beneath it, stained a rusty brown that could have been old ink or something else, was a handkerchief monogrammed with an E. A sound from outside, a child's shout. She froze, shoving the ring box and handkerchief into her apron pocket, closing the drawers with frantic quiet. She scrambled out the window, pushing the frame back into place just as her oldest son, Ben, came running around the corner. "Ma, a rider's coming," he called. It wasn't Silas. A stranger was approaching the ranch at a slow walk. Eliza smoothed her dress, the weight of the stolen items burning against her leg. The man who dismounted was the sheriff of Bitter Creek, a man named Hollies with a weary face and eyes that missed nothing. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "Silas around." "He's out on the range," Eliza said, her voice thankfully steady. "Can I help you, Sheriff?" He looked at her for a long moment, then at the children clustering behind her skirts, just making rounds, checking in on new folks. His gaze traveled over the house, the barn, the quiet yard. Everything all right out here. This was her chance. A representative of the law was asking her point blank, but the image of Silas's controlled rage, of Walter's silent menace, filled her mind. The sheriff was one man, miles from town. Anything she said would get back to Silas before the sheriff's dust had settled. "We are settling in fine, thank you," she said, the lie like ash on her tongue. He nodded slowly, not looking convinced. "You know," he said, his voice dropping, "my wife sent that basket, the jams." He met her eyes. "She was a friend of Alina, good woman, terrible thing, what happened?" He let the words hang. He was giving her an opening, testing the waters. "Silas said she left," Eliza offered carefully. The sheriff's expression turned grim. "That's one story. No body was ever found, no sign of a struggle in the house. But a woman don't just vanish into thin air, not from a place like this." He looked toward the distant ridge. "Course, without evidence, a man's home is his castle. The law's hands are tied." He was telling her he suspected, but he couldn't act. He was also warning her, "You are in that castle now." He mounted his horse. "You need anything, you send word. But ma'am, be careful what you go looking for. Some holes, once you start digging, have a way of caving in on you." As he rode away, Eliza felt more isolated than ever. The law was aware but impotent. The community was fearful but silent. She was on her own. That night, after the children were asleep, she examined her stolen clues by candlelight in her room. The handkerchief stain was definitely blood. The ring was cold and heavy. And then, holding the Bible from the trunk, she noticed the pages were faintly warped, as if by moisture. She fanned them carefully. Near the Book of Psalms, a single pressed flower fell out, a blue flax blossom, and on the margin of the page, in the same delicate hand as the inscription, was a tiny, frantic pencil notation. It was a date, just weeks before her disappearance, and 2 words, "He knows." The following Sunday, Silas announced they would go to church in Bitter Creek. "It's expected," he said, his tone brooking no argument. It was a public display, a performance of normalcy. The service was a quiet agony. Eliza could feel the stares, the prayers that seemed directed at her like warnings. Afterward, on the church steps, a woman broke from the cluster of parishioners and approached. She was older with kind, sad eyes. "I'm Martha Higgins," she said, "the storekeeper's wife. I'm so glad you came." She clasped Eliza's hand, and in that brief contact, Eliza felt a small, folded square of paper pressed into her palm. Martha's eyes held a desperate plea before she turned and melted back into the crowd. In the wagon on the way home, with Silas driving and the children dozing, Eliza carefully unfolded the note under her shawl. The handwriting was swift and anxious. Elena confided in me. She was afraid. He has a temper she hid from everyone. She discovered papers about debt, a loan against the land from a man in Xi'an. The debt came due the month she vanished. She told me if anything happens, look to the well. I dared not speak. God help you, burn this. The well, Eliza's eyes went to the old stone well in the ranch yard, a structure they used daily. It seemed so ordinary. That evening, under the cover of drawing water for the chickens, she peered over the moss-slicked stones into the deep black hole. It was just a well, but Martha's words echoed. Look to the well, not in asterisk it, to asterisk it. She studied the structure itself. The base was ringed with large, flat stones. One on the northern side looked different, less weathered, as if it had been repositioned. That night after midnight, she crept outside with a crowbar from the barn. Working by feel in the faint starlight, she wedged the bar behind the stone. It shifted with a grating sound that screamed in the silence. Behind it was not earth, but a shallow, man-made cavity, and inside that hole was a metal box. She carried it trembling back to her room. Inside were Elena Grant's true treasures, a few letters from her family, a small cameo portrait of her mother, and a journal. The entries started hopeful, talking about the new ranch, Silas's quiet strength. Then the tone changed. Silas is not the man he presented in his letters. The debt is crushing him. He speaks of solutions I do not like. Later, he believes the child will bind me here, that I will accept anything once I am a mother. He is wrong. The final entry was dated 3 days before she disappeared. Walter offered to help me leave. He says he has a conscience, though he hides it. We are to go tonight. I fear Silas suspects. If you read this, I did not leave willingly, and I am so afraid for the child. Eliza sat back, the journal heavy in her lap. Walter, the silent hand. He had tried to help Elena escape, and he had failed. Where was he in all this now? Was he a prisoner of his own guilt, bound to Silas by some shared secret, or had he been complicit in whatever happened that night? The pivot was staggering. The enemy was not just Silas. The entire history of this place was a web of betrayal and violence, and she was trapped in the center of it with 4 innocent children. She had proof now, a dead woman's testament, but proof was meaningless if she couldn't get it to the sheriff. And the very man who might have once been an ally, Walter, was now a looming, unpredictable question mark. 3 days later, the opportunity for disaster presented itself. A late spring blizzard swept down from the mountains, a howling white fury that isolated the ranch completely for 2 days. On the second night, with the wind screaming like a banshee, the livestock in the barn grew agitated. Silas and Walter bundled up to go calm the animals. As Silas pulled on his coat, he looked at Eliza, his eyes dark in the lamplight. The storm will pass by morning, then we have work to do. It sounded like a promise and a threat. The moment the door shut behind them, Eliza made a decision. The journal and the evidence couldn't stay here. She bundled them in oilcloth, crept downstairs to the rarely used front parlor, and pried up a loose floorboard near the hearth. She buried the package deep in the subfloor, a secret for someone else to find if she could not tell the tale herself. As she replaced the board, a floorboard creaked behind her. She whirled around. It was Walter. He stood in the doorway, snow melting from his shoulders, his face unreadable in the shadowed room. He had not gone to the barn. He had been watching her. His eyes went from her face to the freshly set floorboard, then back to her. He knew. He took one step into the room, and the storm outside seemed to hold its breath. Walter didn't move to stop her. He didn't call for Silas. Instead, he closed the parlor door softly behind him, the click of the latch sounding as loud as a gunshot in the quiet house. "You found it," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. It wasn't a question. He looked at the floorboard, then at her terrified face, and something in his hardened expression seemed to fracture. "You shouldn't have looked, but now that you have, you need to hear it from me." Eliza stood frozen, her mind screaming at her to run, but her feet rooted to the spot. Walter leaned against the doorframe, as if suddenly exhausted. "I tried to get her out. That much in the journal is true. The plan was for her to ride to my cousin's place 60 miles south. Silas was away in Cheyenne dealing with that damned loan, but he came back early." He closed his eyes, the memory painful. "He found us by the barn. She had a satchel. I had a horse saddled. He didn't yell. That was the worst part. He just looked at her and then at me and said, "Walter, put the horse away." And I did. I was a coward. I told myself it was his wife, his business. What did he do to her? Eliza breathed, the words barely audible. He took her inside. I stayed in the bunkhouse. I heard nothing. In the morning she was gone. Sealers said she'd run off in the night, taken the horse I'd saddled, but that horse was still in its stall. He said I must have been mistaken, and then he showed me the papers. Walter's face was pale. The loan from the man in Cheyenne, it wasn't just for money, it was a partnership, a silent partner who didn't care how the books were kept. If the law started digging into Alina's disappearance, that partner would withdraw, the ranch would fail, we'd all be ruined, and Sealers made it clear that if I talked, I wouldn't just be out of a job, I'd be implicated. He had a story ready about how I'd been sweet on her, how I'd helped her run off. Who would they believe? A drifter hand or a respected rancher? "So you did nothing," Eliza said, disgust cutting through her fear. "I buried my conscience with every shovelful of dirt," Walter replied, his voice hollow. "He had me dig a new post hole out by the old line shack, deep, said we were putting in a new boundary marker. I didn't ask what we were burying, I didn't want to know, but a man knows, the weight in that wrapped canvas, it wasn't tools." He finally looked at her, his eyes desperate. "He's not a raving monster, Mrs. Carter. That's what makes him so dangerous. He's a calculator. He sees people as assets and liabilities. Alina became a liability. You're currently an asset. You care for the children. You keep the house. You maintain the appearance. He needs to keep the town's suspicions at bay. But the moment you become a liability..." The implication hung in the cold air. The storm outside was abating, its howls softening to a moan. Sealers and Walter would be back in the house soon. "Why are you telling me this?" Eliza asked. "Because I can't carry it alone anymore, and because you have those children," Walter said, nodding toward the ceiling where the children slept. "He won't harm them. They're useful too, heirs to the land, a picture of a family man for the bank. But you're replaceable, just like she was." He pushed off the doorframe. "I won't stop you if you try to run, but you won't make it 5 miles in this weather with 4 young ones, and he'll hunt you. He can't afford another scandal, another wife vanishing." He turned to leave, then paused. "The partner from Cheyenne, his name is Arlen Sutter. He comes out twice a year to look at the books. He's due in 3 weeks. He's the only person Sealers is afraid of, the only one." With that, Walter slipped out the door, leaving Eliza alone with the devastating truth and a single dangerous name, Arlen Sutter. The next 2 weeks were an exercise in sustained terror. Eliza played her part flawlessly, but every interaction with Sealers was now a silent duel. She saw the calculation in his eyes when he looked at her, assessing her utility. She redoubled her efforts with the children, making herself indispensable. She baked his favorite cornbread, mended his shirts before he could ask, all while the secret beneath the floorboards pulsed like a hidden wound. She watched Walter, too, searching for signs of his allegiance. He avoided her gaze, but once, when Sealers was berating a cowhand for some minor mistake, she saw Walter's hands clench into fists at his sides. The tension broke in a way she never anticipated. It was young Ben, her oldest, who triggered it. Fascinated by the ranch hands, he'd begun following Walter around. One afternoon, Eliza found them by the corral. Walter was showing Ben how to tie a proper knot. "My pa showed me this one," Ben said proudly, "before he got sick." Walter had looked at the boy, and for a fleeting second, his stern face softened. "My pa taught me too," he said quietly. That small moment of humanity was their undoing. Sealers observed it from the porch, his expression unreadable. That night at supper, Sealers made an announcement. "Walter, you'll be taking the wagon to Laramie tomorrow. Pick up that new stock of barbed wire. It's a 3-day trip." It was a clear, deliberate removal. Walter's eyes flicked to Eliza, then down at his plate. He just nodded. "Yes, sir." With Walter gone for 3 days, Eliza's last, tenuous connection to the truth, and her only potential ally, however flawed, would be severed. She was being isolated completely. The morning Walter left, Eliza felt the walls closing in. Her only hope was the impending visit from Arlen Sutter. She had to survive until then and find a way to speak to him. But how? With Sealers monitoring every moment, an idea, desperate and fragile, began to form. It involved the children. 2 days after Walter's departure, the crisis escalated. Sealers received a letter from the bank in Bitter Creek. He read it at the kitchen table, his face turning to stone. Without a word, he stood, crumpled the paper, and threw it into the fire. He spent the rest of the day in his study, the sound of a single shot ringing out from behind the locked door, target practice or a message. At supper, he was icily calm. "Change of plans," he said, cutting into his meat. "Sutter's visit is moved up. He'll be here the day after tomorrow." He looked directly at Eliza. "You will prepare the guest room. You and the children will be on your best behavior. You will not speak to him unless spoken to. Do you understand?" Eliza nodded, her throat tight. This was her chance, accelerated and compressed into a terrifyingly short window, but Silas's next words froze her blood. "And you will stop letting Ben wander off with the help. It's unseemly. This is a ranch, not a playground. He needs to learn his place." It was a direct threat, wrapped in paternal concern. Ben's friendship with Walter had been noted, and Silas was cutting it off at the root. He was systematically removing every external influence, every potential source of support. The day before Sutter's arrival, Eliza put her plan into motion. She gathered the children. "I need you to be very brave," she whispered, kneeling so she was at their level. "A very important man is coming tomorrow. While Papa is busy with him, I need you to cause a distraction, a safe one." She looked at her two middle children, 7-year-old Sarah and 5-year-old Jacob. "I need you to let the chickens out of the coop. Just open the gate and shoo them. Can you do that?" They nodded, wide-eyed but serious. "It has to be exactly when I give the signal," a wave from the kitchen window. It was a risk, using her own children as pawns, but she needed chaos, a few minutes where Silas's attention was diverted from her. Olin Sutter arrived at mid-morning in a polished buggy drawn by two fine bays. He was a large man in a city suit, with a watch chain across his vest and eyes that missed nothing. Silas greeted him with a stiff formality that bordered on deference. Eliza served them coffee in the parlor, her hands steady despite the tremor in her soul. Sutter's gaze lingered on her a moment too long. "New wife, Grant, you didn't mention." "Recent," Silas said, his voice tight. "Eliza, Mr. Sutter has business to discuss." She withdrew to the kitchen, her heart pounding. She watched through the crack in the door. The men spread ledgers on the table. Their conversation was low, but she caught snippets. "Yield is down. Bank's patience isn't infinite. Need to see the north section." This was her moment. She gave the signal from the window. A minute later, a cacophony of squawking erupted from the yard. Sarah and Jacob had succeeded. Silas stood up, irritated. "Damn birds," he muttered. "Excuse me, Olin." The moment Silas stepped onto the porch, Eliza moved. She walked into the parlor as if to refresh the coffee. Sutter looked up from the ledger. "Your husband has a fine spread, ma'am, if he can hold on to it." His tone was blunt, transactional. "Now or never." Eliza set the coffee pot down. "Mr. Sutter," she said, her voice low and urgent, "did you know his first wife, Elena?" Sutter's eyes narrowed, all businesslike detachment gone. "I did. Tragic. What happened?" "It wasn't tragic, it was murder." The words fell between them like stones. Eliza saw it then, a flicker in his eyes that wasn't surprise, but recognition. He knew asterisk, or at least he strongly suspected. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "That is a very serious accusation, Mrs. Grant, one that could cause a great deal of trouble for this ranch, for its financial backing." "She was pregnant," Eliza pressed, "gambling everything. She found out about the loan, about you. She was going to leave, and she disappeared. I have her journal. I know where it's hidden." Sutter's face became a careful mask. He didn't deny it, he weighed it. "I am a businessman," he said slowly. "I invest in land and livestock, not in family dramas. What my partners do in their personal lives is their own affair, so long as it does not impact the bottom line." He looked toward the door where Silas would return any second. "A scandal, however, a murder investigation that is very bad for business. It scares banks. It scares other investors." "Then help me," Eliza pleaded. "Get a message to the sheriff. Just take the journal as proof." Sutter studied her, his gaze cold and appraising. He was not a savior, he was a calculator, just like Silas. He was weighing her value as an asset against the liability of a scandal. Finally, he spoke. "If what you say is true and it comes to light, this investment becomes a loss. I do not tolerate losses." He took a card from his pocket and slid it across the table toward her. It was blank except for a Laramie address. "If you find yourself in difficulty, you may contact me here. For a price, I can arrange for a new situation, a discreet one, far from here." He was not offering justice. He was offering to broker her silence, to remove the liability, her for a fee. He was as amoral as the man she was fleeing. Before she could respond, Silas returned, brushing dust from his sleeves. "Damn kids," he grumbled, but his eyes were sharp, darting between Eliza and Sutter. "Everything all right in here?" "Fine," Sutter said, smoothly picking up the blank card and slipping it back into his pocket. "Your wife was just seeing to the coffee, a credit to your household, Grant." The dismissal was clear. Eliza was just another piece of property, functioning well. The rest of the visit passed in a blur. Eliza was hollowed out. The law was hesitant. The only powerful man who knew the truth was corrupt, and her sole ally was a guilt-ridden accomplice who was miles away. That night, after Sutter departed, Silas called her into his study. The room felt smaller, the air colder. He didn't sit. "What did you and Sutter talk about?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "The coffee," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "The weather, nothing of importance." He took a step closer. "You see, Eliza, I'm a man who believes in order, in clear accounts. You are an entry on my ledger, a positive one so far, but entries can change." He reached out and with a chilling gentleness tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers brushed her cheek and she fought not to flinch. "Sutter is not your friend, he is mine, and if you ever become a negative entry," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The ghost of Elena Grant was standing right between them. He dismissed her. Back in her room, Eliza crumpled onto the bed, despair threatening to swallow her. The plan with Sutter had failed. Walter was gone. She was trapped. But as she lay there in the dark, a new grim resolve hardened within her. She had been thinking like a victim, looking for rescue. There would be no rescue. If she and her children were to survive, she would have to stop looking for allies in a den of wolves. She would have to become something this calculated world of ledgers and liabilities did not expect. She would have to become a danger herself. The game had changed. It was no longer about escape. It was about war. And the battlefield was the very home Silas Grant thought he controlled completely. Eliza's new war began not with a weapon, but with a ledger of her own. She started observing not just Silas, but the ranch itself, its vulnerabilities. She noted which fence line needed the most repair, where the water trough was prone to cracking, which mare was the most skittish. She began to perform her duties with an almost fanatical excellence, but she did more. She took over the ordering of supplies, learning the rhythms of consumption. And she started stockpiling in earnest, not just flour and a knife, but matches, twine, a bottle of kerosene for the lamps, and a small whetstone. She hid these not in the house, but in a hollow log near the creek, a place the children showed her during a pretend exploration. She was building a lifeline, one invisible piece at a time. Walter returned from Laramie 3 days later, his demeanor even more closed off than before. The bond with Ben was severed. Walter now actively avoided the children, but Eliza saw the way he watched Silas when his back was turned, a look of simmering, helpless hatred. She needed to know if his confession in the parlor was a momentary weakness or a potential lever. She took a risk. One afternoon, while Silas was in the north pasture, she approached Walter as he mended harness in the barn. She didn't speak at first. She simply placed Elena's small, gold wedding band on the workbench beside him. Walter froze, the leather falling from his hands. He stared at the ring as if it were a ghost. "Where did you get that?" he breathed. "Where do you think?" Eliza said quietly. "You told me the truth. Now I'm showing you I have the proof. The journal is safe, but proof is useless if it never sees the light. I need to get it to the sheriff. I can't do it alone." He picked up the ring, his calloused fingers trembling. "He'll kill you if he finds out." "He'll kill me eventually anyway," Eliza said, the certainty of it chilling her own blood. "When I'm no longer useful, or when I ask one too many questions, you know I'm right, you lived it." She pressed her advantage. "You said you were a coward. This is your chance not to be. Help me get the journal to Sheriff Holly's." Walter was silent for a long minute, the only sound the buzz of flies in the barn. "Sutter's visit," he finally said. "He's the key. Silas is scared of him. If Sutter pulls his backing, the ranch fails. Silas loses everything. That's the only thing that might break him." He looked at her, a hard glint in his eye. "I can't get you to the sheriff. Silas would notice me gone in an hour, but I can get a message to Sutter. I know where he drinks in Cheyenne. I can send a wire. Tell him the liability he discussed is about to become a full-blown scandal unless he intervenes." It was a dangerous, indirect plan relying on the conscience of a corrupt man, but it was something. Do it, Eliza said. A week passed. The tension was a live wire in the house. Then the catalyst came from an unexpected direction, the bank. A formal notice arrived, stating that a loan payment was overdue and the bank intended to foreclose unless the balance was settled in full within 30 days. Sealers read the notice and erupted. For the first time, Eliza witnessed the temper Elena's journal had described. He didn't strike anyone, but he smashed a chair against the hearth, the sound of splintering wood bringing the children running in terror. He turned his fury on Walter. "You were supposed to handle the wire transfer from the Laramie sale," he roared. "The buyer backed out," Walter said, standing his ground. "Market price dropped, I told you." "You incompetent fool," Sealers shouted, his face a mask of rage. In that moment, Eliza saw the man who had made a pregnant woman disappear. The controlled facade was gone, replaced by something primal and terrifying. The outburst confirmed everything. It also presented an opportunity. A man making reckless mistakes was a vulnerable man. That night, Eliza retrieved the journal and the other evidence from beneath the parlor floorboard. She couldn't wait for Sutter. The bank's deadline would push Sealers to desperate action. She had to act first. She devised a new plan, one that involved the entire reluctant town of Bitter Creek. Using the blank paper from the children's lessons, she began to copy excerpts from Elena's journal. Not the whole thing, but the most damning lines. "He believes the child will bind me here. I fear," Sealers suspects. "If you read this, I did not leave willingly." On separate sheets, she drew a simple map of the ranch, marking an X near the old line shack, the place Walter had dug the deep post hole. She made 10 copies. She had no way to deliver them all, but she had a single precious conduit, Martha Higgins. The next supply trip to town was tense. Sealers drove the wagon himself, his mood black. In the general store, while he argued with Mr. Higgins over credit, Eliza caught Martha's eye. She slipped the folded packet of copied journal entries and the map into the basket of goods Martha was packing for them. She gripped the older woman's hand. "Please," she whispered, her voice raw, "for Elena." Martha's eyes widened, but she gave a nearly imperceptible nod, her fingers closing over the papers and tucking them into her apron. It was done. The truth was now in the wild. The return to the ranch was silent, the air thick with impending storm. For 2 days, nothing happened. Then, on the morning of the third day, Walter sought her out as she hung laundry. His face was grim. "The wire to Sutter, no reply. Either he didn't get it or he doesn't care." Eliza's heart sank, but she clung to her other gambit. "Then we hope for decent people," she said. The decent people arrived that afternoon, not as a mob, but as a delegation. Sheriff Hollies' wagon rolled into the yard, followed by a second wagon carrying Mr. Higgins, Martha, and 2 other town elders. Sealers watched from the porch, his expression reverting to its usual cold control, but Eliza saw the pulse beating rapidly in his neck. Sheriff Hollies tipped his hat. "Afternoon, Sealers. Mrs. Grant, need to have a word." "What's this about, Sheriff?" Sealers asked, not moving from the doorway. Hollies held up one of the copied journal pages. "We've received some disturbing writings, attributed to your late wife, Elena. They raise serious questions." Sealers's laugh was short, humorless. "Writings? You mean forgeries? Someone in town has a grudge. You know how folks talk." "Maybe," the sheriff conceded, "but they also provided a map, suggesting we might want to look near your old line shack." He looked past Sealers to where Eliza stood, her hands clasped to still their trembling. "With your permission, we'd like to take a look, to put these ugly rumors to rest, once and for all." Sealers's control was magnificent. He spread his hands. "By all means, Sheriff, dig up my entire property, waste your day, I have nothing to hide." He said it with such convincing affront that for a terrifying second, Eliza thought she had miscalculated. What if Walter was wrong? What if there was nothing there? The men took shovels from their wagon and rode out toward the distant ridge, following Eliza's map. The wait was agony. Sealers went inside, leaving Eliza and the children standing in the yard. An hour later, the men returned. Their faces were somber, their clothes dusty. Sheriff Hollies dismounted and walked slowly to the porch where Sealers now stood. He didn't speak. He simply opened his hand. In his palm lay a small, tarnished silver locket caked in dirt. It was not conclusive proof, but it was a woman's piece found in a hole too deep for a boundary post. Silas's mask didn't crack. An old trinket, he said, probably belonged to a homesteader from years back. Then Martha Higgins stepped forward from the wagon. Her voice, usually soft, cut through the air. "I recognize that locket, Sheriff. Elena showed it to me. It held a curl of her baby sister's hair. She never took it off." She turned her gaze on Silas, and all the fear and anger of 2 years poured out. "You monster, what did you do to her?" It was the accusation, voiced publicly by a respected townswoman, that changed everything. The legal case was still circumstantial, but the court of public opinion had just reached a verdict. Sheriff Hollis's posture shifted from investigation to confrontation. "Silas Grant, I'm going to have to ask you to come into town with me for questioning regarding the disappearance of Elena Grant." That's when Silas made his fatal mistake. He saw his carefully constructed world crumbling, the town's trust, his financial backing, all of it, and he looked past the sheriff, past the elders, directly at Eliza. The hatred in his eyes was pure and undisguised. "You," he snarled, "you meddling witch." He didn't move toward the sheriff. He took a step toward her. It was the action Sheriff Hollis needed. He drew his revolver. "That's enough, Silas. Step away from her." But Silas was beyond reason. In a blur of motion, he turned and lunged into the house, slamming the door. A second later, a shot exploded from within, shattering the windowpane. He was barricading himself. The children screamed. Walter, who had been watching from the barn, yelled, "He's got rifles in there, a whole rack." A standoff ensued. The sheriff and the men took cover behind their wagons. Eliza herded the children into the barn, her mind racing. Silas had the high ground, ammunition, and nothing left to lose. He could pick them off, or he could decide to take her and the children with him. She had to end this. Now. She remembered her stockpile in the hollow log, the kerosene, the matches, and she remembered the most skittish mare in the barn. A desperate, terrible plan formed. She explained it to Walter in frantic whispers. He looked at her as if she were insane, then nodded. It might work. While the sheriff's men exchanged sporadic fire with Silas to keep him pinned, Walter and Eliza worked quickly. They soaked rags in the kerosene, tying them to the mare's tail and flank. They led the mare to the side of the house opposite the sheriff's position, near the dry timber of the woodshed. Eliza took a deep breath, struck a match, and touched it to the rags. The kerosene flared up with an asterisk whoosh asterisk. Walter slapped the mare's rump hard. The animal screamed in terror and bolted, a living torch, straight toward the woodshed and the side of the house. The spectacle was chaotic and horrifying. The flaming mare crashed into the shed, spreading fire instantly to the dry wood. The side of the house began to catch. Smoke billowed. Inside, Silas was suddenly confronted with a new, immediate threat. They heard him coughing, moving. The front door burst open. He stumbled out, not to shoot, but to escape the smoke, his eyes streaming. Sheriff Hollis was on him in an instant, wresting the rifle from his hands and pinning him to the dirt. The fight was over. The fire was contained before it could consume the main house, though the woodshed was lost. Silas Grant, coughing and soot-blackened, was bound and loaded into the sheriff's wagon. As they pulled away, he twisted to look back at Eliza one last time. There was no plea, no remorse, just a final, chilling calculation, as if he were already figuring the angles of his defense. In the days that followed, the official investigation began. With the locket, the journal, Walter's testimony, and the disturbed grave site near the line shack, where the remains of Elena Grant and her unborn child were finally recovered, the case was built. Silas Grant was charged with murder. Arlen Sutter, upon hearing the news, immediately severed all ties and called in his loan, collapsing what was left of the ranch's finances. But here is the final, surprising detail. Eliza Carter did not take Sutter's offer of a discreet new life. She did not return east. At the foreclosure auction, using the small sum she had managed to save from her household allowances, and with the unexpected backing of a consortium from Bitter Creek, led by the Higginses, who had raised a collection for the widow and orphans of that Grant monster, she placed a bid, a low, modest bid, and she won. The Grant Ranch, now free of debt and blood, became the Carter homestead. Walter stayed on as foreman, a free man working for wages. his debt of guilt perhaps never fully paid, but his loyalty now unquestionably given. The children grew up on the land that had once been their prison, their memories of terror slowly softened by years of honest work and their mother's fierce, protective love. Eliza never remarried. When travelers asked about the lonely woman who ran the spread so efficiently, folks in Bitter Creek would tell a simplified version of the story. But sometimes, Martha Higgins would set the record straight. She didn't answer an ad for a wife, she'd say. She answered an ad for a victim, and she rewrote the entire ending. The dangerous secret was not just Silas Grant's crime. It was the system that delivered women like Eliza into the hands of such men, expecting them to be silent. And the real story is that sometimes, against all odds, they found their voice, and it was louder than a gunshot. Eliza Carter's story is a single, stark thread in the vast and often dark tapestry of mail-order marriage in the American West. Historians estimate that by the turn of the 20th century, tens of thousands of women had embarked on similar journeys, answering advertisements that promised escape, security, or simply a chance. For some, it worked. They found partnership and built lives on the frontier. But for many others, the reality was one of profound isolation, deception, and in the worst cases, a vulnerability that turned deadly. The system itself was a gamble, stacking the odds against those with the least power. The case of Silas Grant and the vanishing first wife is extreme, but it is not unique. The historical record whispers of other disappearances, of abrupt departures that were never investigated, of women who became ghosts in the ledgers of remote homesteads. What makes Eliza's tale remarkable is not just her survival, but her reclamation. She didn't just escape a dangerous man. She took the very instrument of her entrapment, the land, the home, the system, and turned it into a legacy for her children. In doing so, she wrote a different ending to a story that was supposed to have only one conclusion. The mail-order bride phenomenon never truly ended. It evolved. Today, international marriage brokers facilitate thousands of unions, and while modern laws like the International Marriage Broker Regulation Act aim to provide some protection, the core dynamic of economic disparity and desperate hope remains. The stories of Anastasia King and others remind us that the danger Eliza faced is not confined to the history books. It is a recurring pattern wherever vulnerability meets opportunity. So what are we to make of these stories? Are they merely cautionary tales about the perils of trusting strangers? Or are they something deeper, a testament to the incredible resilience of those who, when cornered by circumstance, discover a strength they never knew they possessed? Eliza Carter, the widowed mother of four, looked into the abyss of a calculated evil and did not blink. She fought not with the weapons of the frontier, but with observation, with patience, and with a mother's ferocious love. She turned a ledger of liabilities into a blueprint for survival. The West was not won by gunslingers and cattle barons alone. It was built, and sometimes rebuilt, by the quiet courage of people like her. People who arrived with nothing but a desperate hope and decided that their story was not yet finished. Their names might be lost to the official records, but their legacy is written in the wind that still blows across the prairies, in the fences that still mark boundaries, and in the simple, enduring truth that sometimes the greatest frontier to conquer is the one within. If you found this journey into a forgotten chapter of history compelling, be sure to subscribe. We delve deep into the untold stories, the hidden figures, and the dramatic truths that shaped our world. Thanks for watching.